told me I was late. I was back there jawing with Ron, and I heard all y'all got real quiet, and I looked at my watch, and it's 10 o'clock, Brian. Pay attention what's going on. Great to see you all this morning. And again, we are working through our study of the book of Proverbs together, and glad you're able to join us in this study this morning, whether you're able to be out with us, or for those who are shut-ins or sick at home, we're glad you're able to join us as well this morning in our study. If you would, though, before we get into the study itself, let's bow our heads together. We'll share in a word of prayer and then enter into our discussion this morning. Father, thank you for the beauty of the day that you've provided, the great opportunity that we have to come and to worship, to study your word, to appreciate your message. Thank you for the wisdom that you provide and the guidance that it gives to us on a daily basis. Father, as we studied this morning, give us the courage to be active and to find ways to serve you and to honor you, and to be very careful to not become slothful or lazy in our service towards you. Strengthen us in our study today, and let it encourage us to know the good that we all can do in service to you and in building up the cause of Christ. Thank you again for the promises founded in Jesus. Thank you for His sacrifices, and it's through His name that we pray. Amen. So let's talk about this a little bit this morning, and there's, depending on your translation, how that might read a little bit, but a lazy man buries his hand in the bowl, but he won't what? He won't feed himself, right? He'll get a big old handful, but he's too lazy to lift it from the bowl to his mouth. And that's the imagery that the proverb writer is trying to get us to appreciate there. Let me share it to you from the text themselves. Proverb 26:15 is reading rendered this way, and that's completely wrong, by the way. Just ignore what I just put up there. 19:24. No, I put it right. Never mind. Trying to remember which way I did these. Let me look myself. I know what I did. Never mind. I tricked myself for a second. I had them both on there, and what I did was I overwrote the one and put up the others. Anyway, Proverb 26:15, which is correct. The slothful hideth his hand in his bosom. It grieveth him to bring it again to his mouth. Proverb 19:24 is similar, right? Basically same message about encouraging us to appreciate the importance of not being slothful or lazy, and that's our discussion this morning. And so before we get into those texts or looking at that idea, Jeff in his material, and we'll do the same, actually begins in Titus chapter 1, right? He begins in Titus chapter 1 and in verse 12, and he makes a pretty strong statement there in that text. Who's he talking about there, and what's he say? The Cretans, right? You ever wonder why somebody might be called a Cretan? I don't know. Maybe it comes from this text because he talks about them. But by Cretans, what does he mean? They were from Crete, okay? They were from Crete. That's what he's referencing here in this idea. And what's he say about them? They're liars. Okay, he says they're liars. They're slow bellies, or they're lazy, right? They're evil beasts. It's pretty powerful language. It's unusual in some ways. For a writer like Paul to describe a group of people as he writes to Titus concerning this matter, that he would describe them in such a forceful way. By the way, where is Titus? Not tricking you here. He's in Crete. What's he doing there? Well, go backwards. If you got your Bibles open, go backwards a few verses. What's he there to do? Appoint elders. That's exactly what he's there to do. He's there to appoint elders in the church. That's where that list of one of the places we get the list of qualifications from elders from. And so he begins at the beginning of chapter 1 of the book of Titus and begins to tell Titus, listen, you're going to Crete. When you get there, you're going to have to appoint men to serve as elders. This is what you're looking for. But be careful. Why? Because this is their reputation. I don't know whether I have, until I studied it from this context, whether I ever fully appreciated that about how hard it must have been for Titus to go into Crete and find men who were qualified to be elders in a place that Paul describes as generally, in a generic way, this. You're going to have a challenge here, Titus, but you need to find them anyway. And you need to find men that are qualified despite the fact that even one of their own, a prophet said, the Cretians are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy. Now, to me, I think what we learned from that is laziness is what? If they kind of all had become that, it's contagious. It's contagious. Right? If you're working on a 5-man crew and 4 of them want to take a break, what are you probably going to do? You're going to take a break. And if the 4 of them want to extend that break, what are you going to do? You're probably going to extend that break, right? It can begin to influence the thinking. And apparently, in that place, they had allowed themselves to be so influenced by various entities among them that this is the kind of general description. Not a pleasant one, by the way. Not a very positive description, but the description nonetheless of what those folks there in Crete had become known for. Let me share what Jeff wrote in his material. He said, "No doubt this is a fine bit of hyperbole. Surely there was at least one worthy resident of the island where Titus did his evangelistic work. The poet's point, however, is sustained. Lazy gluttons are a drain on everybody, destroyers of corporate morale, and usually among the most vocal critics of those who are working actively." And so Jeff kind of gets to the core of the problem, right? What's happening is that laziness and that slothful mindset that the proverb writer is speaking of, it drains on everybody. It eventually affects the thought processes and the mood and the energy levels of everybody. It destroys the morale of groups, and it's interesting, that last phrase he mentions, and usually among the most vocal critics of those who are working actively. Sometimes the most slothful of individuals are the greatest and largest critics of those who are actually busy, working, and diligent. Now again, these are generic, general kinds of concepts, doesn't necessarily have to always be true, but it's the impact of kind of the message that we need to appreciate out of this particular proverb. I'll slow down for a second. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I'm trying to get the concept of this dipping into the bowl. I mean, maybe it's not important, but I do know that Last Supper, when Christ was asked by the disciples who was betraying him, he said, "Who I dip the bread into the bowl and give to." And then that is the dipping that we're talking about here.
No, I don't think they're connected. I think all he's talking about here is
the act. I mean, just feeding, like dipping bread into a bowl.
Yes, I think. Yes, he's just talking about the idea here that and he's right. It's just a picture. It's an analogy. It's a way to try to describe what laziness is, and in his effort to describe what laziness or slothfulness is, it's like a guy who all he can muster is the energy to get his hand to the bowl. He just can't seem to find enough effort or energy or desire to lift his hand and actually feed himself. That's the picture I think that he's working on here to describe what laziness is.
I was a little bit confused with the fact that some say the guest would dip the bread or the host would dip the bread for the guest and give it to him. And I thought, is this what they're talking about? They're being too lazy to dip their own bread in the bowl, or?
That would be another figure of the same kind of thing, right? It's just that they would sit there and stay hungry because they're too slothful to just lift the hand and feed themselves. That to me is the imagery of what these two proverbs we're looking at this morning are talking about. And that's kind of the same of what you're talking about there.
I believe there are lazy gluttons.
Yeah, it's interesting words, right? They don't seem to go together. But you can, and yet they can be, right? Because they won't do it for themselves, but they can still be a glutton because other people are doing it for them. Because other people are doing it for them. And so you can become a glutton without lifting your own hand, without doing anything, if people facilitate that. And I guess that's kind of the imagery here, right? They won't do anything for themselves, but as long as you're doing it for me, they're perfect fine. And we've all, don't look around the room, keep your eyes straight, but we've all know people like that, right? They're willing, and I'm not, you know what I'm doing, never mind. I always get the filter back on today. But anyway, you get it. There are people that would just sit there and let other people just take care of them hand and foot all the time and not do anything to help their own purpose or cause. Question 2. By the way, if you grab sheets off the back table today, sometimes I'll separate those, but make sure you're on the second page. It's the second sheet of the 2 sheets that go out weekly. How are the 5 talent, 2 talent, and 1 talent man described in Matthew 25? So just real quick, somebody refresh me. What's the parable?
Master's gone away. One 5 talents, 1 2, and the other one 1. 5 talent invests it or works with it and doubles it. The 2 talent does the same, and the 1 talent man just bears it.
That's right. So that's the basic parable that Jesus shared, right? 1 man was given 5 talents. There's another version of this, right? And the numbers change, but it's the same principle. But one gets 5, one gets 2, and they both get busy. And they earn a return on what their master had provided for them. The man who only received 1 talent, within his scope and ability to handle, right? That's kind of the imagery of that. Some people can handle 5 talents and be responsible for that. Some people can only handle 2 talents and have to be responsible for that. He gave him the abilities from which he could fulfill, and all he could think of to do was just do nothing. And his fear of displeasing the master by failing in some ways with that 1 talent led him to do nothing at all, which was in some ways worse. The imagery is the master would have preferred him try to do something, and what happens. But if you notice, let me just share with you 2 quick portions of Matthew 25. Verse 21, his Lord said unto him, and this is what both the 5 talent and the 2 talent man heard when the master came back. His Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. The 1 talent man hears this, verse 26. His Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful, there's our word, thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reap where I sowed not, and gather where I have not sowed or strawed. We can appreciate the fact that this man may have had some concerns or fears of what might have happened to him if he had squandered or just lost the talent that his master, his Lord, had given him. But the lesson for us is God wants us to be what? Working, active, right? He wants us to be active. And I don't, right, there's this interesting balance as believers and followers and as Christians where there's a rightful place for the idea of fear and respect and the Bible talks about it. It's a fearful thing to fall into what? Into the hands of the living God, right? And there's truth to that. The Bible talks about work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, right? There's an appropriate understanding of who God is, His power and might that He has, and the level of proper fear and respect that we should have for Him. And yet, when He talks about our active service for Him, He says, don't work out of fear, but work out of what for Him? Love. I think I heard it. Work out of love for Him. And somewhere we've got to find this balance to not be so fearful, 1 talent man, so fearful that he might make a mistake with the 1 talent that he was given. He thought the best option he had was just to bury it in the ground And by that, he's guarding it, right? That's the idea here. He's just going to try to protect it. He'll hide it away. Nobody will know where I buried it. Then when the Lord returns, I'll just go back to the spot. I'll dig it back up and just give Him what He provided me. I didn't lose anything. And that's work motivated by fear, afraid of missing or losing. And God really doesn't want us to be motivated that way. He wants us to be motivated by love and purpose and action. When we make mistakes, we own them, we're honest about them, we fix them, and then we move forward again, right? And I think sometimes we can become slothful in some ways unwittingly because we just kind of are sitting back and thinking, well, I'm going to protect what I've got, and I'm going to, and we're not really putting any effort to kind of move forward, and it's an act of laziness when we do that.
That if he had have worked with this one talent and lost it, there would have been forgiveness there. I mean, is that what we're supposed to draw from this?
That's what I draw from it, Kim. That the Lord, at minimum, right? You could have put it in the bank. You buried it in the ground. You could have taken it to some place that borrowed and lended money and got interest. You add those other narratives as it relates to this. I really do. I think the idea here was he would have rather have seen him active and trying than to just sit back and do nothing. And I think you're right. I think he would have found a place for forgiveness. If he had tried to do something in service to the master and failed, at least then he could have sought mercy and forgiveness. Whereas this, you didn't do anything.
The God that I serve now is a lot more loving and forgiving than the one that I was taught as I was growing up. I just now caught that part of that. Maybe the rest of you are way ahead of me, but that's,
No, and I appreciate that because I think that happens a lot. There are times, I'll just to give you an illustration for me, I don't know that I always made the connection in Titus 1 until I restudied it in this context. I've always looked at those qualifications for elders and appreciated what Titus's work was and thought about that way, but never really gave much thought to the fact he's doing that in Crete. When Paul described Crete in verse 12 as a bunch of lazy folks. So sometimes you do, right? Sometimes when you've studied for years, but then you come across something and you see it from a different viewpoint or a different context, it's not that you didn't know or understand before, it just gives a greater meaning or a greater appreciation of some text like that. Go ahead, Mike.
I read that and I say that the Lord wasn't going to let him fail.
I agree with you there, Mike. If any, all three of them, right? If they would have purposed themselves, then the Lord would have been with them. That's the picture. It's a parable with a physical Lord in the picture. But if this is an imagery of God and what He does for His servants, then I agree with you. I think that then when the Lord sees us active, He'd work with us and help us through that process.
All three men had ability. Yeah. Maybe not equal ability, but they all had some kind of ability to do something with what the master gave them.
Right, and I think that's key to this too, as well. The Lord and Master in the parable and in reality isn't asking anybody of something they cannot fulfill or accomplish. And so all of them had the ability to do something, and He gave it to them proportionately based on that concept. Be active. That's the overwhelming message here. The third question was this: what example is used in Proverbs 6, and what lessons should we learn? So what's the example there in Proverbs 6?
The ant.
Go to the whom? Go to the ant. What? Right? You read that and you go, go to the ant, thou sluggard. Go look. Let me share verses 6 through 9 of Proverbs 6 with you. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, no dictator, no commands, no one forcing anything, They provide her meat in the summer, gather her food in the harvest. How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard, when wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? We've all maybe seen, right? You've seen ants, and they are some of the most resourceful little creatures you've ever seen. In the way they're able to, you ever trimmed around your sidewalk, and you walk away, and it feels like 5 minutes later there's an anthill. Somehow they were able to, in the 5 minutes you went to the garage and back outside, here's this little mound where they've already been able to dig a hole and create this home for themselves, and you've seen them maneuver and move pieces of material and food. The point is, they find a way, right? And they find a way by working, by being active. And so the proverb reminds us, listen, thou sluggard, even the ant can find a way. Even the smallest of God's creatures can find a way. And if the smallest of God's creatures can find a way to prepare their meat in the summer and gather food for harvest, or in the harvest, then there's so much more. God's greater creation, right? Learn something from the active, working, diligent approach of the ant towards the things it needs. So keep that in mind. So then what disorderly conduct is described in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3? Okay. Yeah, so look at verse 11. And this is another one of those texts, by the way. I think we do kind of the similar things like we do with Titus 1 a little bit. But here's 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 11. For we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. Now, what do we usually think of out of 2 Thessalonians chapter 3? What portion of that text do we generally think of? No, I'm not trying to... Well, that might be true of that verse. I'm talking about the whole text. If you go back in the beginning of this text, what are they told to do with the disorderly? Yeah, you don't work, you don't eat. And he says to do what in the first part of the chapter? Withdraw yourselves from everyone who walketh disorderly among you. And then he tells us what he means by disorderly. Now, I'm not saying that general principle shared in the first part of the chapter cannot have larger implications and can be used as a principle to point to any disorderly conduct. But all I'm saying is sometimes we look at the beginning of the chapter, and then we start to point to all kinds of disorderly conduct. I've heard lots and lots of lessons on withdraw yourselves from those who walketh disorderly without a single reference to what actually was said about who was disorderly in the chapter. I've heard a lot of lessons about all kinds of disorderly conduct without any reference. And I'm just trying to illustrate to you that sometimes we can get caught in this initial statement of a context and maybe miss the fullness of what's being said. He defines for us who he meant. Who he meant were those who were taking advantage of their relationship with other Christians, were abusing that relationship and receiving benefit and partaking of the generosity of the group and weren't doing anything. They weren't working at all and were being busybodies. Now again, I'll step back a little bit from that statement. I'm not saying that we can't examine other disorderly actions of people and it fit within the framework of the text. I understand that the need for that at times. But let's not forget he had a particular funnel of thought here. That a trouble that he was trying to correct and solve. And the problem was, and by the way, let me just add this. The local congregations in the New Testament were much more communal than we are. And what I mean by that is they were depending a lot on each other for how they were taking care. Now, I'm not saying we aren't communal, and I'm not saying that we don't help one another, and I'm not saying we don't do good things for each other. But the truth is, we don't necessarily, from those standpoints, from those kinds of things, we don't necessarily need each other quite as much as they did. They were depending on each other. Somebody had the ability to grow some certain grain, and so he would take that grain and share it with the group. And somebody maybe had some livestock, and he would take some portions of that livestock and he'd share it with the group. And somebody had a place to live, and he'd share it with the group. They were much more communal in that sense. And so when Paul saw some things going on in Thessalonica, he was concerned that there were some slothful people taking advantage of that communal relationship. And he says, you need to withdraw from that guy. You need to step away from that slothful individual who's abusing the relationship and address that. Now, all of that to get to this point. And it goes back to something we talked about earlier. A lazy man can also be a glutton. How? Because we facilitate it. Paul tells that church at Thessalonica, quit facilitating that slothful man. Quit facilitating his behaviors. He needs to work with his own hands. He needs to get actively involved. Do not, Paul says, not me, Paul says, do not coddle that individual and allow them to continue to abuse that community relationship that you have built there among the believers in Thessalonica. Don't let him do that. Instead, withdraw yourself. Why? Because when you withdraw yourself, what else goes with it? The food and the help and the aid and the assistance that is allowing that person to continue to be lazy. And the hope is that at some point they'll what? They'll get hungry enough to work. They'll get hungry enough to not be lazy anymore. And we sometimes, maybe we call that tough love at times or whatever. But now, there are people that have legitimate needs. I'm not, right? They had a community, and they were helping each other because they all had different kinds of needs, and they were willing to and wanted to help, and they were all lending a hand to that purpose. But some were walking disorderly. And rather than being active, when you're sitting back doing nothing, then you got nothing else to do but to meddle what? Meddle in other people's business, right? They became busybodies because they just sat around and did nothing. And it's a hard principle to appreciate, right? Because nobody wants to see somebody go hungry. Nobody wants to watch somebody suffer or be challenged in ways. But sometimes people are going to learn anything. Sometimes that for some that's the only way it's going to be learned. I remember, and just to illustrate this, when my kids are real picky eaters. They've always been real picky eaters. And we go, when I'd travel in gospel meetings and they were able to travel with us sometimes, people would start catering to them. And they're like, well, what do you like? And what can I do? And they'd fix a meal and they didn't like anything. And they said, well, let me fix you something else. And I'm like, no. When they get hungry, they'll eat something here. And if they don't, they'll be all right. Because maybe tomorrow there'll be something they like and they'll be fine. They'll be fine. Because you didn't want them to get into that mindset that the world was about whatever they wanted in that moment. And going 100 miles out of the way to make sure that they had exactly what. Now listen, grandparents, I know, I get it, right? When grandkids come, do whatever you're going to do, right? I get it. But just remember, though, that the parents got to deal with them when they go back home, and now you might have to restart all over again. But you get the point I'm trying to make, right? You can't, if you just cater all the time, we might be actually fostering some slothfulness. And especially in adults. I use the children as an illustration, but especially in adults. And that's who 2 Thessalonians 3 was dealing with. I'll breathe. Next question. What does laziness often become the origin of? And I asked you to see the class materials for that, trying to point you back to help you find what I'm looking for. Excuses, right? That's what Jeff talked about in the material. Let me share with you what he wrote. That's a little small. Maybe you can read that. Laziness is the origin of much excuse making among disciples who would rather not get involved, but who do not necessarily want their apathy to become obvious. I don't want to do anything, but I don't want people to think I don't want to do anything. So my inclination then is to start making excuses. They're always too busy, too out of pocket, too ill, too whatever, right? Now, Jeff's not saying that there might not be a moment where you are too ill. He's not saying there's never a moment where you don't have a pocket that can handle that situation. That's not what he's trying to say. What he's saying is, if I'm always finding something, right? If there's always something, and when that one doesn't work anymore, I just find the next reason. And when that one doesn't fit anymore, I just find the next reason. And I just keep finding all the excuses. Then I'm never really going to push to be very, very active. There is a difference between an excuse where we're just trying to get out of doing something and a reason why I can't do that. Those are two completely separate things. And I'm not necessarily lazy because I'm not able, right? The 1-talent man couldn't do the other 4 that the 5-talent man got, right? He couldn't he wasn't able. And it wouldn't have been excuse making for him to just accept the work and role that he could do with the 1 talent he was given. We've already kind of had that description in that discussion this morning. But if I'm always finding, right, if there's always something that is a hindrance to everything, not just a particular thing, but everything, then I might want to step back and take stock of that and think about, am I just rationalizing everything? And am I just excusing myself for things? And not to tell tales or to be judgmental, but I imagine we've all done it, right? We've all probably been in a circumstance where maybe everything that was necessary for me to help in that moment was available to me. I just didn't want to do it, right? I just didn't want to. And we've all probably had moments like that we have to grow from and get better from and not let it become a pattern of our behaviors and choices. And the fear is, and I think what Jeff is trying to get us to see is that if this becomes our habit, where we're just always finding that reason, that excuse as to why not today or not me or not whatever, it becomes just kind of just natural to us to do that. Real quick, in our last couple of minutes, whose example should be followed in Hebrews 6:11 through 12? Well, certainly not the slothful. Who was it in that text? But be followers of whom? In verse 12, that ye be not slothful, but followers of them who through faith and patience inherit the promise. That's who we should be learning from. The slothful man's pretty easy to learn from. I may have told you about a fellow I knew one time. He told me that when he worked, I can't even remember where it was he was working. I don't even remember where I met the guy now that I think about it. I'm trying to figure out whether I was in Alabama or whether I was here. But anyway, I met a fella, and he was telling me how he learned that the patterns of his employer and the manager that was on the site. And so they would work while the manager would make his normal morning run, and they knew the manager would be gone for the next 2 hours. And so when the manager wasn't around, they didn't do anything. And when the manager would come back around, they were just busy as they could be. And then the manager would go away and then didn't do anything else. And you kind of learn patterns, right? And you kind of get into habits. Don't learn from those guys. And maybe a word of advice or caution here, because I think the Bible would challenge us as believers and as followers and as Christians to not be slothful in anything. Right? Not just in spiritual matters and for the work and cause and purposes of Christ. Not just slothful in those kinds of spiritual things, but we should not have a reputation among a community or among others as I guess, he's always lazy, just lazy, won't ever do anything. Right? That is not a good imagery of who Christ is. It's not a good example of who the Savior is and the God that we serve. And so be very cautious that we don't become slothful in those ways, and follow good, patient, long-suffering, hard-working examples. What happens to a building or a house where laziness exists? It falls down, right? Ecclesiastes writer wrote this, by much slothfulness the building decayeth, and through idleness of the hands the house droppeth through.